This is Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.
And yet, we know from Exodus, no man can see my face and live. I think John has this in mind in the opening chapter of his gospel when he says, no man, not even faithful Moses, actually saw God face to face. It was the highest revelation of the Old Testament is through Moses. But now with the incarnation of the Son of God who comes from the bosom of God, this is the prophet par excellence.
Hello and welcome to Theology on the Go. I'm Jonathan Master, joined as always by my friend and co-host, James Dolezal. James, how are you today?
Jonathan, I'm great, and I'm looking forward to our continuing conversation with Michael Morales about his volume 1 of his Numbers commentary.
Some books that come along just demand at least 2 conversations, and I think we both felt that we could have done 4 conversations or 10. This is just a rich work, but we're going to pick up at the end of our last interview and begin to talk about to Michael Morales again about his Numbers 1 through 19 volume. So Michael, thanks again for joining us.
Well, this is, since you have teased it now with a couple of references to John's Apocalypse and sort of the new heavens and the new earth. I want to talk a little bit about the celestial aspect of the camp and how it is imaging on earth, it seems, or replicating on earth something that is in heaven. And we even get this when Moses goes up on the mountain, he sees the pattern, and the pattern he sees for the dwelling of God is a celestial pattern. And then when he descends, he comes down to, as it were, implement a replica of it on earth. What are we to make of? I've got some angel questions for you down the road, and you know this about me, Michael. So I'll just let you know that's coming. But before we get there, how is the earthly camp how are we supposed to think of it in relation to heaven? Just put it to you that way.
Yes. This is part of the reason why, even though the Pentateuch is legitimately fivefold, and I think it's arranged topically as well as chronologically, so, Numbers, I would argue, is arranged through ecclesiology. Nevertheless, we need to maintain the unity of the Sinai revelation. And so often it's a challenge to keep in mind what began all the way back in Exodus, and you referenced it. So chapter 25 and following, a lot of the furnishings for the house of God, Moses is told specifically to make sure it's constructed according to the tabnith, the pattern that he sees, the heavenly pattern. And so we already have this idea of a heavenly temple, an earthly temple being created. Now, again, it's very easy to just dismiss that by the time we get to Numbers, but I was greatly helped, especially by ancient Jewish sources like the Midrash, where they kept the unity and made the connection. You don't just create God's throne room and God's house, but even as God's throne is surrounded by the myriads of hosts in heaven, so his earthly throne will be surrounded by the myriad of hosts. And so there's a lot of just great quips, like whenever God travels through the heavens, he takes his heavenly entourage with him. Now that he's going to travel on earth, he takes his earthly entourage. And in Numbers, in terms of just the words used, I mean, we call the Lord Sabaoth, Yahweh Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts, typically having in mind that he is surrounded by the angels. But that word Sabah occurs numerous times in the opening chapters of Numbers. Israel is continually called the host of Yahweh. And so the connection actually isn't that difficult in the Hebrew. Now, unfortunately, most English translation will render it something like armies, which is legitimate, but you don't exactly
see it in the English, right?
Right.
The connection to the heavenly hosts.
Yeah. Now one interesting Jewish folklore that captures this is that when God landed on Sinai with his angelic hosts, they were arrayed as his heavenly camp with banners. And so the Israelites saw that and got jealous and said, hey, we want banners too. And God said, oh, okay, you can have banners. And apparently this is the origin of flags. And all the nations envied Israel and said, we want flags too. But what they're capturing there is that reality that what's going on, the wondrous reality that's going on in those early chapters of Numbers is God is creating this earthly host, this entourage with among whom he's going to dwell and with whom he's going to sojourn.
I think we sometimes forget when we think of Moses on the mountain with Yahweh that the myriads of angels were there. I mean, Galatians 3 tells us that. So we know it, but we don't know it. We forget it, I think, sometimes that he actually ascended up into a camp of celestial beings. And that is also part of, when I think of the pattern, I often think of it strictly in terms of the tabernacle. Would you say, though, it seems that you're saying the pattern is also the camp pattern as well, which he's seeing as he's up there on the mountain with God and the hosts?
Yes, that's been a very helpful shift for me in the last number of years to think in terms of covenant community. There's a lot of temple theology, temple's big in biblical theology, and that I love that, but we can't stop there. And I think that's part of the drama of John's gospel as well. Jesus is there, the Son incarnate among his people, but he's not yet within them. There's greater things to come, and so. The book of Leviticus centers on the tent of meeting. If you're defiled in any way, you can't approach it. But what's fascinating, in Numbers 5, the opening verses, it applies those same defilement laws to the entire camp. There's a new entity now. It's not just the temple alone, but God with his people. And that says something significant about the covenant community.
Michael, you anticipated my question because I wanted to talk about Numbers 5 and 6 briefly. So those can be difficult passages, both in their substance, just in and of themselves, and then also in the context of the whole book. And you're right, at the beginning of Numbers 5, it has these rules of unclean people, and it specifically says because they need to be taken out so they won't defile the camp. So the whole focal point is the covenant community not being defiled. But then, so that fits. But then we get this elaborate test for adultery, which is hard for us to often even understand and make sense of. But whatever it precisely was, it's detailed for us. And then the Nazirite vow. So I wonder if you could pull all that together. Again, the opening paragraph fits very neatly with the big themes that you've been addressing, but then put in context and maybe give a little explanation for that significant and sort of complicated test for adultery, and then right into the Nazirite vow.
Yeah. Great question. And of course, critical scholars will just say Numbers became the dumping ground, Leviticus was closed. So you're just going to bring in whatever laws you want to add. And so they don't look for rhyme or reason. But even among mainstream scholars, I found some very helpful work done to show that these laws are paradigmatic. They're not just random. And so the first law relates to oath taking and the idea of in some way stealing from a neighbor. Then we have that odd law, the wayward woman, the woman suspected of adultery, and then the Nazirite vow. What I started to see, and again, great help from Jewish sources on this, that first law about stealing is neighborly relations. We get to the woman suspected of adultery, and that's clearly marital, family relations. And then we come to the Nazirite, and that's one's relationship with God. And so we see these three spheres of life lived in the presence of God in the camp that they become paradigmatic for. Now, you mentioned specifically the last two, and those two are rightly contrasted. Again, in the history of interpretation, they have been, and without, I guess, getting into the weeds too much, what I came to see is that right before the camp sets off onto the wilderness sojourn, these are two alternate paths. So Nathan MacDonald is an example, a scholar at Cambridge, where he mentions that understanding this woman suspected of adultery as a figure for Israel, he says that is the literal meaning. And there's a variety of scholars that would agree, myself included, given the comparison of the language with language that the prophets later used for Israel. So you can either abandon your husband, whom you just entered into covenant relationship with, for the pleasures of this life, or you can gladly, like a Nazarite, forsake pleasures for a temporary time period, like the wilderness sojourn was supposed to be a matter of weeks, and use that time to draw near to the Lord. And so throughout the wilderness sojourn, we find that these motifs keep coming up. For example, when the outer camp fails, God's response to that failure of not entering into the land in Numbers 15, the very end of it, we have these tassel laws, where they have to create tassels that basically gives them the color of a priesthood, and it also uses the language of wings, which gets to James' angelic.
I've got that one saved. It's in my
angelic
arsenal.
host. And they're basically told to not go lusting after your eyes, but to take heed to follow the commands of the Lord. Ultimately, we see the language coming up again in Numbers 25, sadly, Baal Peor, where the second generation commits spiritual harlotry. That's the only time we get the same cluster of words from that paradigmatic law, whereas the Nazarite law keeps showing up every time God is responding to the people, urging them to, look, there's not even grapes in the wilderness. So you've already got one of the three restrictions. And even if you don't literally take the vow, the idea is to approach the sojourn saying, God has good things for us in the land. In fact, one of the proofs that the land is a good land are these huge clusters of grape. After your limited, duration of your vow, you can enjoy wine in the land of God and all the good things of God. But can you not, for a matter of weeks, be willing not to have all the luxuries and pleasures of life and use this time to draw near to the Lord? And so those two paths really become keys to understanding the wilderness sojourn. If we have time, I would love even to get into how the wilderness sojourn follows the actual blueprint of the camp.
Well, that is a good place for us to go next. But just to summarize, to make sure I'm understanding. So the question about the adultery and the Nazarite vow being more involved than the first command, which has to do with their honesty with respect to donations and that kind of thing. The fact that they're more involved indicates that they are kind of paradigms for the whole for Israel's options, so to speak, or the choices set before Israel in the context of the wilderness.
Yes, there's a lot of clues. So we're not just ignoring the first legislation about the donations, but there are a lot of clues that the wayward woman and the Nazarite are to be compared. There's key words that they're shared, like the woman's hair is loose. The Hebrew parah is also used for the Nazarite's locks. The punishment, so we read about her womb falling, nafal in Hebrew. Well, the Nazarite, if he gets defiled by a corpse, his days were told fall, nafal. So a lot of unique terminology. And again, the ancient rabbis made the comparison. They basically said anyone who saw the ritual for the woman suspected of adultery would forego wine and take the Nazarite vow. So there are a lot of little tidbits like that show historically that it was understood these two are meant to be compared, but primarily it's the way they show up again in the wilderness sojourn.
All right. Well, just before we go into the sojourn, I'll ask you to indulge me briefly on this because I know you want to get to the sojourn, and maybe that will be a good finale for this second installment of our interview. I do want to ask about the cherubs, and since you already alluded to it, I'm going to read a quote of yours from the introduction to the book, and this is about the blue tassels that are being tied on the wings of their garments. You say, and this is perhaps, so I know that you're not going dogma here, perhaps the sacred noble calling bestowed on the Israelites by the blue corded tassels on the wings of their garments affirm their status as the earthly counterpart to the heavenly hosts of Yahweh. Um, you do say perhaps, and you don't make it into a big thesis, but what is the maybe you could speak a little bit about what is the relationship between the cherubs and the people of Israel in the camp? Why do the cherubs, how do they factor into all of this? And again, I know I'm just asking for you to indulge my own curiosity here, and then we'll go to the wilderness wandering right after that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know I have anything more profound than the relationship that we talked about. And this is something that pervades Jewish literature, extra biblical literature, like again, the Essenes and Qumran that I mentioned before, that God's people on earth mirror the angelic host. It's like our Lord taught us to pray, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And like Psalm 103, they do his bidding. And that's always a goal for the people of God to mirror in our own capacity on earth. But you do have, so throughout the tabernacle, I think I have a little section in the commentary just pointing out what we can often forget, that it's more than just the cherubim on the veil leading into the Holy of Holies, but the inner drapes for the high priest to walk into the holy place. It's just surrounded by cherubim. And the idea, and it's part of God's grandeur, it's part of his majesty, it's part of his holiness, that he is surrounded by this angelic host. And I think, although the average Israelite can't walk into there, they know, and some of them help craft these curtains, that this is who God is, that he is holy, and on earth they are to be his earthly servants. And so I think that comparison is pervasive. So, I mentioned perhaps, I guess, to hedge my bet, but I do think that it's part of this comparison. And again, it's not something that I'm just whimsically thinking up. There's a great history to this.
It even seems to gesture toward the unity, in distinction, but still the unity of holy angels and a holy people, that we are, in fact, a single congregation that is holy to the Lord. They're just better at it than we are.
Right. Yep. Hebrews 12.
At least in this life. At least in this life. All right. And I'll let Jonathan take us into a final discussion about the wilderness wandering and.
Yes, well, that's fine.
Chapters 11 and
that's
on.
Right.
To
that's right.
18.
So let's get into it and talk to us about the significance of the sojourning. So yeah, when we get into Numbers 11, we've been there's so many things to explore in the book of Numbers, and your commentary really addresses them well. But let's talk about the sojourning and the significance of that. I'll just leave it that open-ended for you to explain.
Thank you. It'd probably be helpful to step back and just give the parameters. So I would label Wilderness Sojourn proper chapters 11 through 25. The commentary goes the first volume 1 through 19 because that covers the first generation. But in terms of what I hinted at before, that the sojourn follows the map of the camp, we need to include chapter 20. And so what we will find is God has established this covenant community, but it is completely new to his people. There's been hierarchies that have been turned upside down. Many think that the firstborn would have been, the natural, the priest, etc. And so what we find is that throughout the sojourn, every aspect of what God has given is going to be tested, and it does it very systematically. So again, with sort of just an overview before I give some details, chapters 11 through 15 give us a focused look at the outer camp of Israel. That's what I am referring to, the 12 tribes. Chapters 16 through 18 give us a focused look at the inner camp of the Levites and the priests. Chapter 19 is a transition. Chapter 20, the focus turns to the central part of the camp, God's house, and Moses as representative of God's reign. And what we find in each of these is a failure on that part of the camp. So fascinatingly, chapters 11 through 15, the word Levite doesn't occur at all. And again, we have to think in terms of parts of the camp. The Levites were not implicated at all in Israel's rebellion to not enter the land, but they do have their own rebellion shortly after. So what I found fascinating is as soon as you get to chapter 11, we have that prologue where Israel's sins are punished by God. But if you notice, the punishment is on the outer skirts of the camp. The fire of God burns the outskirts of the camp. And that lets us know we're literally starting at the very edge of this picture of the camp, and we're working our way inward. So in chapters 13 and 14, lo and behold, we get 12 leaders that represent the 12 tribes, the outer camp. And as we learned in our childhood song, 10 were bad, 2 were good. And so the leaders basically lead God's people in rebellion against God. They slander the land. They're judged immediately with a plague, but the outer camp is made to suffer. They were called in obedience to God's word to be an army, and that's how they failed. They failed as a militia. Chapter 15, again, responds to them. Then immediately, chapter 16 begins, and we're in the inner camp of the Levites, where Korah, who camped with Reuben in the south. And so it's not a surprise that Reuben's involved in this, even though the focus is on the Levitical camp. Again, Reuben as firstborn may have had rights or presumed rights to the priesthood. They rebel. And God needs to teach them that the one he has chosen is the one for their good. And so, whereas in chapters 11 through 15, God exonerates and vindicates Moses when he's slandered, he is the leader of that outer camp. Well, the leader of the inner camp is Aaron. So God is going to vindicate Aaron through the blossoming of the staff. Then we get to chapter 20. And if you are paying attention, you may have put together that the outer camp is the office of prophet. Moses' prophetic role is exonerated by God. Go to the inner camp, it's priesthood, and Aaron's priestly role is exonerated by God. So we're expecting kingship, and sure enough, obviously the Lord is the sovereign king over his people. He wanted to demonstrate, I argue, his kingship to the second generation that had arisen. I did a study of ancient Near Eastern imagery, and one of the major motifs is that a king supplies water. This is what he's known for, whether through aqueducts or canals. And God wanted to supply an abundance of water to the second generation. Moses, sadly, a faithful man, he's tainted by the first generation. He treats them like the first generation. He misrepresents God. And this is crucial because everywhere else when Moses speaks, unless he's interceding with God, God speaks. So the one time Moses himself adds a crack in that relationship, he must be judged severely. So he misrepresents God's kingship. God vindicates himself by opening the fissures up and supplying an abundant amount of water for his people. But Moses has failed. And so each part of the camp fails, and God vindicates. But by the time we get to Numbers 21, everything has been reestablished, and we see the second generation going from glory to glory. They do sin, but they repent, and they sin again greatly in Numbers 25. But for the most part, they are teachable, and when God judges them, it has this gracious effect of molding them. There's a great argument that the second generation is the greatest generation Israel has ever known.
So pull the threads of that a little bit, Michael. You've introduced the prophet, priest, and king motifs. The Lord is teaching these important things, and obviously He's instructing the Israelites as they rebel against Him. How? Just for a moment, we haven't done much of this throughout our conversation because we're so interested in some of these exegetical questions, but just pull the thread of that a little bit and talk about the ways in which that applies to our own understanding of who we are and how we're to approach the Lord. In other words, what does it teach us? It taught them those things. What does it teach us?
That's a great question. And I think seeing this rubric, one of the helpful things is it's not just general sin in the wilderness. They're very specific. And for us as God's people, is not only our submission to, but our thankful praise for each of these offices, of course, as they culminate in Christ. And so to me, it's a great preaching strategy to know for these chapters 11 through 15, I want to make a bridge to Christ as prophet. And you know, John does this for us in a helpful way. So in Numbers 12, when God defends Moses, he says, you know, if there's a prophet among you, I speak to him in dreams and vision, not so with my servant Moses. I speak with him. Literally, it's mouth to mouth. And yet we know from Exodus, no man can see my face and live. I think John has this in mind in the opening chapter of his gospel when he says, no man, not even faithful Moses, actually saw God face to face. It was the highest revelation of the Old Testament is through Moses. But now with the incarnation of the Son of God who comes from the bosom of God, this is the prophet par excellence. And then when we come to the priestly office, I mean, how does God vindicate Aaron's work? By this life out of death sign at the very heart and center of the book. In the midst of a wilderness plagued with death, life sprouts forth. And, you know, the Acts of the Apostles, for example, mention that through the resurrection of Christ, God has vindicated him and established that this is the one name under heaven by which we must be saved. And so it directs us. You know, I think there's the humbling aspect. We need the ministry of the prophet, the priest, but it also gives us an avenue of glorifying God for his provision for us in Christ. And then, of course, kingship. The Son perfectly reflects the Father's reign and is even now ruling and subduing. And so we have this posture of humility, but also, again, the thankfulness for his provision. He spreads a table and he gives abundant waters in the midst of the wilderness. And so I think in helpful ways, it can direct us to focus on the gifts of God through Christ. And through Christ, through leadership of the church, the elders and deacons, and, you know, even within families, the application, I think, goes all the way down to the hierarchies that God establishes in our lives.
I think, Lord willing, when Volume 2 is in our hands, we want to talk more about some of the well-known stories, the Balaam story, and the Balaam account, all those things as well. But I want to end with this question for you, particularly with the sojourn. You just made you gave us a broad, sweeping account of the sojourn, the big lessons that are being taught, the things that are being shown about the Lord and about his people. I wonder if you could even take a further step back and give us a broad sweep of the book. And I know that we were trying to restrict ourselves to chapters 1 through 19. That's the volume we have in front of us, and so that ties our hands a little bit. But let's put that aside, take a step back, and say, all right, where we've covered those first 19 chapters roughly. But give us the broad sweep of the book. We began our first interview by talking about it as an ecclesiology of the Torah, but then sort of thematically, how do we move through? How are we taught the ecclesiology of the Torah as the book of Numbers unfolds?
I think there's a simple threefold outline that would be helpful. So chapters 1 through 10, the camp of Israel or covenant community. Chapters 11 through 25, the sojourn of Israel, and we can make all the parallels like the author of Hebrews does to the journey of God's people now. And then chapters 26 through 36, the land of Israel. And what's going on in that latter section is everything we've learned from chapters 1 through 10 is going to be implemented in the land of Israel. And so there would be a lot of connections with where the tribes are around God and where they are in the land. But it's all about the gift of the land and this precious life with God in the land. And so one way to see that more clearly is an inclusio. So right after the census in Numbers 26, we have the daughters of Zelophehad. So these 7 sisters who lost their father, there's a place in the land even for them. And we know this of God, that he cares about the outcast and the lowly. The other end of that inclusion, chapter 36, is where some of the leaders of Manasseh say, well, wait a minute, it's a wonderful Jane Austen story in the making. Someone's got to write this. So you got these young ladies that have come into this great inheritance. Well, if they marry people from other tribes, we're going to lose land. And Moses, through the Lord's direction, ensures that the land cannot be lost. And that's the idea. So gaining the land and retaining the land, the gift of God is yours to keep. He's made every provision for it. Now, there are many gems in there that I'm skipping over, but that's one way to look at it. And in a way, as we would apply Revelation 21:22, life in the land with God and some of its glories.
Well, I think that's a great way to end. I will give this teaser for when Volume 2 comes out, and we twist Michael's arm to come back on with us for an hour or so. You said your heart is actually in that second half of the book, that there's something about that second volume, beginning in chapter 20, that has really captured you. I think we got a little bit of that just in your outline. But Michael, thanks so much for giving us your time today for 2 episodes and for answering all our questions. And really, the thing I think both James and I are most grateful for is just your labor in writing these volumes, which I think are going to serve, and I know have served me, but I think are going to serve many people who are seeking to understand the scriptures better.
Thank you, Jonathan and James. It's always a joy to be with you.
James, I was pleased in this second conversation that we were able to get into some of the big picture material, particularly with related to the sojourning. And Michael did just an outstanding job of capturing what that's all about in broad brushstrokes, and really what the whole book is about. So if you that part at the end is pure gold, where he outlines the whole book. But really, we commend this commentary. I think you said at the end of our last interview that you think this is going to be the standard for another generation or so, and I think that's right. And you can even see from the application he drew just how relevant this book is, the book of Numbers, that is, and then how helpful his volume is on that book.
I think it's entirely possible that pastors who never dreamed of a sermon series through Numbers might now begin to think it's possible, because they have, not that there aren't other good works and studies on Numbers, but this is the kind of commentary that is really going to enrich sermon material. Certainly for Bible students, this is going to be a standard resource, but especially I want to emphasize for pastors that need to bulk up this part of their library, and not just bulk up their library, but bulk up their studies as they prepare to preach the Pentateuch. I think they're going to find this to be an invaluable resource on the book of Numbers.
Yeah, I've joked with Michael that I look forward to, in a year or two, seeing the sermon series coming out from various pastors on the book of Numbers, because I think this resource is going to just really fuel that. If you'd like a chance to win a copy of this book, you can enter your information at placefortruth.org or theologyonthego.org. If you know someone who might be helped by this episode or other episodes, please pass it along. And we love getting new listeners. We love hearing from new listeners and from listeners who've been with us for a long time. If you can rate and review the podcast, that's an easy step that you can take that helps us get the word out. And if you're able to donate, you can do that at alliancenet.org or placefortruth.org. And as always, thank you for listening to Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.